Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Core studio. Welcome to the show. So, Strixhaven spoiler season might be over. Well, kind of, technically, yes. But with Strixhaven, we're also getting 5 Commander Precon decks as well, so spoiler season is not done yet. Yesterday, the Lorehold deck was revealed, and there were a lot of exciting new cards. So if you haven't seen that episode, make sure you check it out to see if Monologue Tax is a new Smothering Tithe. And today the Prismari deck has been revealed, and there are a lot of exciting things in it as well. Now with quick takes like these, I am probably going to be making some mistakes. These cards are as new to me as they are to you, and I'm just going to give you my initial quick thoughts on them. So I very well might misevaluate or misinterpret a card. My apologies if I do that, but I'm trying to get these episodes out as quickly and as efficiently as I can. So with all that said, let's jump into it. And the first card that I want to talk about I think can be a huge one in Commander with Reinterpret. Reinterpret is an instant for 2 blue-red, and it says, counter target spell, you may cast a spell with an equal or lesser mana value from your hand without paying its mana cost. Yeah, that's gonna be valuable in a game of Commander. A counter spell that allows you to cheat out something from your hand. And to my knowledge, this does get around timing restrictions, so you could cast a sorcery or a creature, etc, etc. But please let me know in the comments below if I'm wrong with that. Regardless, I'm going in that assumption, so let's continue. Essentially, you counter a huge spell with this, and you can cheat out an equally as big or slightly less big spell from your hand. This can turn around a game in an instant and help you do some really crazy and powerful things. In pretty much any game of Commander, there are going to be some big spells cast. If someone casts a big draw spell like a Blue Sun Zenith, you're going to say, thank you for all that free mana, because now I'm going to cast my biggest thing from my hand. And even if, say, you're only countering something that costs 4 mana, you're still getting a lot of value out of this. The cards that this reminds me of the most are things like Mana Drain as well as Spell Swindle. Basically, cards that counter a spell and generate you mana. Now, obviously, Mana Drain is on a whole nother level, only costing blue, but still. 4 mana to counter a spell and have the potential to get an absurd amount of value, game-ending value out of something? Yeah, I can see this seeing a lot of play. And though this might be a very specific circumstance, keep in mind that you can counter your own spell. So if, for example, say you're playing a Golos deck and you hit this off the top with something else that's big but you don't want to cast it, you simply counter that spell and then cast something from your hand for free. Again, definitely a corner case, but there are different kinds of applications that you need to consider with this card. Overall, I can see this card being pretty popular and a fantastic card to turn a game around. But speaking of free mana though, let's talk about Rousing Refrain. It's a sorcery for 3 red, and it has to spend 3 for 1 in a red. So basically, instead of casting it, you can pay that cost and then put 3 time counters on it. In the beginning of each of your upkeeps, remove a time counter from it. When the last one's removed, you cast it without paying its mana cost. Anyways, the card says, add red for each card in target opponent's hand. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end, exiling Rousing Refrain with 3 time counters on it. This card is reminiscent of one of my favorite cards in Magic with Chronomantic Escape. Although it does something completely different, it does have that exact same suspend 3 after you cast it. Essentially, this is a ritual that you keep getting back every 3 turns. So by suspending this on turn 2, then every 3 turns you can get a ton of mana for free. Now obviously this amount of mana is dependent on one of your opponents, but chances are one of your opponents is going to have a decent amount of cards in their hand. And of course, you can also manipulate the number of cards in their hand with things like wheel effects to force everyone to draw up to 7. And getting a free 7 mana in a turn can be game-ending. So this card can be incredibly impactful in a game of Commander. Now, obviously it's not for every single kind of deck out there, but there are certain decks that can really utilize a card like this. Decks that want to generate absurd amounts of mana or cast X spells or wheel a lot can really use a card like this to great effect. And again, I just love that design of a card that you cast and then you get back a couple of turns later, then you can cast it again, and then so on and so forth. Essentially just investing in this for a small amount early, you get a ton of value later. So I'm excited to see Wizards continue to explore this design space. And speaking of that, there's Inspiring Refrain. It's a sorcery for 4 blue, and it says draw 2 cards, exile Inspiring Refrain with 3-time counters on it, and it's got suspend 3, 4, 2, and a blue. So obviously this is the exact same type of design as Rousing Refrain. I mean, it even has the same musicians in the picture, they're just different ones playing. Now, this one does cost 1 more to suspend and 1 more to cast. And rather than generating you mana, this one draws you cards. Now, when comparing the two, I think Rousing Refrain is a lot better. I mean, every 3 turns draw 2 cards is nice, but not great. A card like Divination is the baseline draw 2 cards for blue. And much like that suspend cost, it also costs 2 and a blue. So Divination draws you those 2 cards right away, whereas this one you've got to wait 3 turns to actually draw those cards. And if you need to draw those cards right away, you've got to pay twice as much mana at 6 mana in total, for just 2 cards. Now, yes, every 3 turns this is going to draw you 2 more cards, but you need to go through a lot of turns to really get your value back on this one. Even if you just played a simple draw engine like maybe even a Kumena's Awakening, you'd be getting more value out of that over time. Now, if this one was draw 3 cards, that's probably a different story, and I don't think that that would have been busted. So I kinda wish they had printed that, because to me, this one doesn't really seem all that playable. When comparing the 2 refrains, a 3-mana investment is a lot more than a 2-mana investment, and you can recoup that mana and that value a lot quicker with Rousing Refrain. Again, I could be very wrong on this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, so let me know in the comments below. But now let's move on to another 6-mana card with Surge to Victory. It's a sorcery for 4 red, and it says exile target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard. Creatures you control get +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is that card's mana value. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player this turn, copy the exiled card. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So there's actually a good amount of things going on with this card, so let's break it down. First off, you exile any instant or sorcery, but only from your graveyard. Creatures you control get a boost of power based on that spell's mana cost. Now, in order to get extra copies of that card, you've got to hit with creatures, but for each creature that you do hit with, you get a copy of that card to cast for free. So my immediate thought is extra turn spells or extra combat spells. And actually, extra combat is basically just, you win. Let's say that you exile a Savage Beating, so all of your creatures are getting +5/+0. Let's say that you've got a creature with flying or some kind of evasion. You hit with that creature, ouch, that's an extra 5 damage on top of whatever that thing's power already was, but more importantly, you copy the spell. So you copy Savage Beating, you untap your creatures, you get an extra combat, and you swing again. You hit again, you copy again, etc, etc. So yeah, as long as you can keep getting one creature through, your opponents are dead. Again, or even just exiling an extra turn spell like Temporal Manipulation can just lead to pretty much game over as well. For each creature that you hit with, that's a lot of damage, and that's going to be a lot of extra turns. Again, it doesn't even have to be extra spells, it can just be really big spells. If you've got an ultimatum in your graveyard, like say a Cruel Ultimatum, that's an absurd amount of value when you hit with multiple creatures. And don't even get me started on like a Brilliant Ultimatum or a Genesis, etc, etc. And there are definitely going to be times where you don't even need to cast those cards to win. Simply exiling a huge instant or sorcery from your graveyard pumps your team to an absurd amount. Exiling a 7-mana spell pumps your entire team by 7, and yeah, that's going to be a ton of damage coming through. And if you've got a commander like the Locust God, which makes a ton of flying locusts, you can just pump your team and swing out and kill your opponents pretty quickly. So I can see this being a fantastic finisher that can do some really crazy things in the right deck. But now let's move on to another new card with Muse Vortex. It's a sorcery for X blue, and it says exile the top X cards of your library. You may cast an instant or sorcery spell with mana value X or less among them without paying its mana cost. Then put the exiled instant and sorcery cards that weren't cast this way into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this is an epic experiment, but different and just in blue. Let's break down the differences really quick. With Epic Experiment, essentially the difference is that you're going to be casting any number of instants and sorceries with a cost of X or less. So whereas Muse Vortex is just letting you cast one thing off the top, you can cast a lot more with Epic Experiment. Now the one benefit that Muse Vortex does have over Epic Experiment is saving your X spells. If you hit some other X spells with Epic Experiment, sorry, you're not really going to be able to cast those for anything. With Muse Vortex, if you hit some instants and sorceries and some of those are X spells, you can just keep those in your hand. And you can still get value out of this by casting a non-X spell that's an instant or sorcery. Both have their benefits, though Epic Experiment, in my opinion, is definitely more of a game-ending card than this one is. That's not saying that this one doesn't have value though. In Spellslinger decks that are focused on casting a ton of instants and sorceries, this can provide you an absurd amount of value. You're basically getting a lot of instants and sorceries off the top of your library into your hand and being able to cast one of them for free. So a spellslinging commander like Mizzix will definitely want to consider a card like this. And the new Galazeth Prismari might want to consider it as well. Dumping a ton of mana into this can refill your hand and let you cast something huge for free. And speaking of casting huge X spells, let's move on to our next card with Elementalist Palette. It's an artifact that costs 3 and it says whenever you cast a spell with X in its mana cost, put 2 charge counters on Elementalist Palette. You can tap it for 1 mana of any color, or you can tap it to add colorless for each charge counter on it. Spend this mana only to cost spells that contain X. Zaxara players are salivating as we speak. Now, I said this on my last episode, but I'm gonna say it again. Typically, I like mana rocks that tap for at least half the amount of mana that you put into them. So if you pay 2 for a mana rock, you want it to tap for 1 or 4 for 2, etc, etc. So a mana rock like this one that costs 3 and only taps for 1 better have a huge upside or a lot of utility. And for the right deck, this is enormous upside. Again, if you're in any kind of a deck that has a lot of X spells, this is going to overperform for you. When I first read it, I definitely read it a couple of times because I thought there's no way they could have said 2 charge counters instead of just 1. With an X spell deck like Zaxara, this will build up incredibly quickly and generate you a ton of mana. Now, you can only utilize that mana for X spells, but again, if you're in that kind of a deck, you're going to have plenty of X spells to dump that mana into. And of course, there are other ways to get more counters on this, like ones that put additional counters on something, or proliferate effects, etc, etc. And again, even if you're in that X spells deck and you don't have any X spells in your hand, you can still utilize this for mana. So it's nowhere near a dead card, and it has a huge amount of upside for your deck. Again, I'm really liking these designs of mana rocks that might not start off that efficient, but have other kinds of utility or can build throughout the game and can be even more impactful. Next up, we have a brand new Storm card with Fiery Encore. Fiery Encore is a sorcery for 4 and a red, and it has Storm, so when you cast this spell, you copy it for each spell cast before this turn. It says discard a card, then draw a card. When you discard a non-land card this way, Fiery Encore deals damage equal to that card's mana value to target creature or planeswalker. So basically, cast a bunch of spells, cast this, and then draw a bunch, discard a bunch, and then deal out a bunch of damage. Now, unfortunately, this really can't be a finisher unless you've got other things that actually utilize that damage when you ping a creature or a planeswalker. So to be honest, I'm kinda disappointed in this. Obviously, you can take out a lot of creatures and a lot of planeswalkers, but unfortunately, you really can't finish off your opponents unless you've got something like a Stuffy Doll or a Brash Taunter in play. And typically with a Storm deck, when you're storming off and casting a ton of spells, your Storm spell is usually your finisher, like a Grape Shot. If this could hit players, it would be a much different card. Now, would that be overpowered? I don't think so, but then again, I was the player that built that Joyra deck that storms off, and I didn't think that was too powerful, and it definitely was. So I might not be the person to ask when it comes to evaluating Storm cards. Regardless, keep in mind that this card is going to help you rummage a ton. So even if it's not the finisher, it can help you dig to the finisher by helping you discard cards and draw cards. But again, if you want to dish out damage, you have to discard actual cards and not just lands. So I might be undervaluing this card, but I'm pretty underwhelmed at this point. If it said any target or target player, I'd be all in. Next up, let's talk about Creative Technique, a sorcery for 4 in a red. It has Demonstrate, so when you cast this spell, you may copy it if you do choose an opponent to also copy it. Now, this is a new mechanic, and a quick note, in my apologies on yesterday's episode, I definitely made a mistake with that Demonstrate card. Because, of course, I read it too quickly and didn't fully understand that when you cast this, you get a copy of it as well if you want to give an opponent a copy. So basically, there's the original, a copy that you have, and a copy that an opponent has. Again, my apologies, and hopefully in the future I don't make that same or similar mistakes again. But knowing me, that's pretty much bound to happen. Anyways, it says shuffle your library, then reveal cards from the top of it until you reveal a non-land card. Exile that card and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may cast the exile card without paying its mana cost. Hey, do you want 1 or 2 things for free off the top of your library? Yes, please. In a big spells deck like a Joda or Golos deck, this can provide you an absurd amount of value. Getting 2 massive spells off the top of your library and being able to cast them for free is a very game-changing thing. Now, of course, you can use this as a political tool. Each of your opponents is probably going to want a copy of this, so just pick whichever player is going to give you the best deal. Or what I probably should say is whatever player is going to make you a good deal and also doesn't also have giant spells in their deck. Again, picking the player that has huge spells in their deck like a Joda deck or a Golos deck is a terrible idea. Or at least I should say that it's a terrible idea the vast majority of the time. It's definitely going to be a safer bet targeting someone else that just has a Spellslinger deck or something that's lower to the ground. Cool, you got to cast a Brainstorm for free. Good for you. I got to cast World Spine Worm and Emrakul the Promised End, so everybody wins. Now do keep in mind that the first words in this text are shuffle your library. So you can't just set the top of your library with something like that Brainstorm to actually cast what you want. You are getting something random, which is still a lot of fun. And speaking of getting something random, there's Dazzling Sphinx. Dazzling Sphinx is a 4/5 Sphinx with flying that costs 3 blue. When it deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile an instant or sorcery card. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost, then that player puts the exile cards that weren't cast this way on the bottom of their library in a random order. So if you've got a friend that has a Golos or a Joda deck again, you're gonna wanna use this. Okay, so I'm gonna hit you, let's reveal off the top. Oh, in Garrick's Wake, that's lovely. Okay, I'm gonna cast that, get rid of all your creatures and planeswalkers. Now, obviously, this can provide you a lot of value or basically none. If you hit, say, a counterspell, that's not gonna be very useful. But in, say, a Sphinx tribal deck, this can just provide you a lot of generic value. And again, it has the potential still to hit some game-changing cards. But now let's move on to another creature with Radiant Performer. It's a 2/2 human wizard with flash that costs 3 red. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, choose target spell or ability that targets only a single permanent or player. Copy that spell or ability for each other permanent or player that spell or ability could target. Each copy targets a different one of those permanents and players. So in a way, this card reminded me first of Zada, basically copying spells for every target available. Now where I see this one having probably more application is with abilities being copied. Because copying that spell, you're probably going to be copying an opponent's spell or a small spell that you also cast. Otherwise, it's going to get pretty mana intensive if you try to cast something big and then copy that. So if you cast, say, a small cantripping targeting card like Expedite, you can cast it and draw a ton of cards. Basically, you're expediting for each creature on the field. You can also utilize this against someone's Swords to Plowshares to just get rid of an entire board. Again, it's probably going to be easier to time this with a commander that has a certain ability, though, that just targets one thing. I mean, does this work with something like Admiral Beckett Brass? I think so, but let me know in the comments below if I'm wrong. Anyways, next up, let's move on to Sly Instigator. It's a 2/4 human wizard for 3 and a blue, and it has pay a blue, tap it until your next turn, target creature an opponent controls can't be blocked, goad that creature. So basically by goading it, that creature has to attack and it can't attack us. Now I've kind of been thinking that they would design a card like this where you basically goad a creature and protect that creature to make sure it gets through. Forcing a creature to attack an opponent and making sure that opponent gets hit is a big thing. This is a good way to not upset a player as much when they swing at another player with a creature that you force them to attack with. This is a good way to keep the most powerful creature on the board off of you, and instead force that creature to swing at someone else. Now, how many decks does this really fit in? I'm not all that sure. This card has a decent amount of mana investment at 4 mana, and then you still have to pay for that effect each time you want it. And of course, you're only doing that once each time around the table unless you've got a way to untap this, or to copy the ability, etc, etc. Anyways, next up, let's talk about Inferno Project. Inferno Project starts off as a 0/0 elemental with trample for 6 and a red, which is not great, but let's keep reading. It enters the battlefield with X++1 counters on it, where X is the total mana value of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. So yeah, this thing's gonna be huge when it comes into play in a lot of decks. It's not the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard, it's the total mana value. So if you've got some big spells in your graveyard, congratulations, this thing is massive. It also has trample, so you're going to be getting a ton of damage through with it. Now, unfortunately, this does not have haste, but if you've got another way to give it haste, which you've got a lot of options to do so in red, then that's probably game over for one opponent. So again, for the right deck, especially in a deck that can give this haste, that can be a game over swing. And finally, there were 3 new commanders that were spoiled in this Precon deck as well. Now, I might tackle these in quick takes at some point, but I'm still going to give you my first impressions of these cards. Varen Voice of Duality is a 2/2 Efreet wizard that costs 1 blue red. She has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, Varen Voice of Duality gets +1/+1 until end of turn. It also appears to have a typo, but I believe it would say if you are casting or copying an instant or sorcery spell that causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Basically, this doubles up all of your triggers when you're casting instant sorcery spells. That is huge. I can see this not only being the commander for a ton of decks, but also being in a lot of decks as well. I mean, just think of having this in a deck with Talrand out. Every single instant sorcery spell you cast gets you 2 Drakes instead of 1. Yeah, you can take over the game pretty quickly with that. Or how about for a commander like Niv-Mizzet Parun? Every single instant and sorcery that you cast is going to draw you 2 cards instead of 1. And of course, thanks to Niv, that's going to be 2 damage now instead of 1 as well. So yeah, this card has a lot of applications in Commander. Next up, there's Octavia Living Thesis. It's an 8/8 elemental octopus for 8 blue. It costs 8 less to cast if you have 8 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard, and it's got Ward 8. Ward is essentially a lesser hexproof. Basically, if an opponent wants to target this, they've got to pay an extra cost based on that ward amount. So yeah, being ward 8, I can see them not being able to target this pretty much ever with anything. It has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, target creature has base power and toughness 8/8 until end of turn. So yeah, I can see this being a Spellslinger deck or a mill deck or a combination of the two with some tokens in there. A lot of cool things going on. And I can also see this being a potential include in a Spellslinger deck as well. And finally, there's Rionia Fire Dancer. It's a 3/4 human wizard that costs 3 red. It says at the beginning of combat on your turn, create X tokens that are copies of another target creature you control, where X is 1 plus the number of instant and sorcery spells you've cast this turn. They gain haste, exile them at the beginning of the next end step. I gotta be honest, I am really excited about this commander. Basically, you cast a ton of instant sorceries, and you get a ton of copies of one creature, most likely one with a very powerful ETB or attack trigger. Yes, I would love 5 Molten Primordials, please. Or how about just 5 Hell Riders? This is definitely a commander that is reminiscent of Brutaclad, but with a twist. And yes, there are a lot of applications for this commander in other decks as well. But now this episode is wrapping up, so again, my apologies if I made any mistakes or missed any cards. I'm trying to do these episodes as quickly and as efficiently as I possibly can. And I am very much only human. But being human, I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Let me know what your thoughts on these cards are. What are your favorites? What don't you like? What do you like? What did I underestimate? What did I overestimate? And make sure you're on the lookout for my next Precon Quick Take tomorrow. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.